Lonely rancher. Took in a young woman, abandoned at the fence. Her fate changed in Wild West stories. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. On the red, dusted land, an old rancher had lived alone for 20 years, always setting an extra bowl at the table. Then one morning, he found a girl abandoned by the fence. From that moment, the silence of his world began to crack, giving way to a story no one could have imagined. Could two wounded souls learn to stay together beneath the roof of the same weathered cabin? For 20 years, there had been nothing but silence, yet he still kept a bowl no one had ever touched. Morning in Wyoming came slow, like an old man catching his breath. Dew lay thin over the dry grass, on the back of a chestnut horse grazing its own shadow, on the bundle Samuel Carter had left out the night before. He was up before the sun could climb the ridge, kindling a fire with scraps of pine and pouring coffee into a chipped tin mug. Inside the cabin, every object knew its place. The saddle hanging by the door, the boots turned neatly outward, the small table meant for two, but long missing its second chair. He had lived this way for more than 2 decades, reading the wind in the smell of damp earth, marking the seasons by the fading ring of distant cowbells, measuring his years by the ache in his shoulder whenever the weather shifted. Silence wasn't a companion, just a tenant who had stayed too long, familiar with every crack in the house. Each morning, Samuel let it cross the threshold, neither welcomed nor chased away. He ate cold biscuits, listened to the fire snap, shrugged on a heavy coat, and led his horse out to walk the fence line. The fence was the one boundary he could trust. Old pine rails, barbed wire gone dull, posts that never lied. He followed it the way someone might reread an old letter, slow, letting his eyes rest on each knot and join. At one corner, a nail had worked loose. He stopped, pulled a thin knife, tightened it, and ran his hand along the wire as though smoothing the brow of a gentle animal. To anyone else, the task would be meaningless, but to him it stitched one day to the next, like seams holding a tear in place. By afternoon, the wind had sharpened. He stacked hay, pulled canvas tight over the winter stores, rubbed grease into the saddle. Now and then he lifted his head, gazing at the hollow blue horizon, like a man about to ask a question he didn't dare speak. Over the years, he had learned to skirt markets, to avoid gatherings. In town, people greeted each other with a short call and a nod. Samuel did the same, turning his wagon before any talk could take root. Folks said he was a man of few words. The truth was, he rationed hope. The winter before, the postman had once left him a letter by mistake, a thin brown envelope addressed to a widow in a mining town up north. The handwriting was neat and slanted, the message plain, ending with a proposal. No promise of riches, only the vow to build a home, a warm place, if you'd try a life of peace. Samuel read the address, slid the letter back into its envelope as though it had burned him, and rode out to return it. Passing the general store, he saw the widow standing in the shade, holding another postcard, her eyes tracking the wagons that passed without choosing a voice to answer. For a moment, Samuel thought of his own wooden table, of the second chair still sturdy. Then he reined the thought in, tight and short, before it could carry him too far. At night, the wind slipped through the cracks in the door, sounding like a faint voice calling from the past. Samuel fed more wood into the stove, sat down, and wrapped his hands around a mug gone cold. On the wall hung an old photograph, so faded only the pale backdrop remained. He neither touched it nor looked away. Some losses, a man learns to live with the way he endures weather aches. They come on schedule, flare for a moment, then fade. Yet somewhere between the fire's breathing, he caught himself keeping a peculiar habit, setting out 2 bowls when he made soup. The second one he washed, turned upside down, and left ready. He laughed at himself, let the dust have it, and still he left it there. Another morning, the sun rose the color of honey. Samuel lifted his coat from the wooden peg, pausing on the threshold, listening to the horse's paw at the dirt. Then that old unease, the familiar fear tucked somewhere near his heart, rose like a thin cloud. It made no sound. It whispered that closeness was dangerous. Those who arrive will leave, and those who stay will fall silent, sagging like a lantern before the wind. He stood still, letting the fear move through him as one might let a cold gust cut through a coat and then pass. He opened the door, letting the wooden latch tilt to one side, a tentative new habit, leaving it unbarred while daylight lasted. Just that small thing, and the stove seemed a little warmer. Or perhaps it was only the illusion of a man too long alone. He carried cornmeal out to the porch, sifting it with steady hands. The powder drifted down like snow, settling in a pale layer along the edge of the table. At its far end, the second bowl still lay upside down, its rim leaving a clean circle free of dust. On the peg nearby hung an old cloak, shaken out and ready since the week before. Samuel never bothered to explain to himself why. By late afternoon, when the hill shadows stretched to touch the fence line, he led his horse out to graze farther afield, quietly checking the posts at the northwest corner, the ones the wind worried most. His hands knew every split, every grain of wood, the way they once knew the shapes of letters, though it had been years since he'd written to anyone. But that evening, when the wind carried the smell of fresh bread and the faint ring of church bells from town, something in him slowed by a beat. Perhaps it was the memory of the misdelivered letter. Perhaps the thought of the widow standing in the shade of the market, clutching things she had not yet dared to believe. And suddenly, he understood. The second chair was not just wood, not just a place to sit. It was an unspoken invitation, a kind and empty space waiting to be filled with someone else's breath, if, someday, a wandering soul should lose their way and find it. Night fell, and the stars came out. The fire murmured in the stove, speaking the language of those who know how to wait. No urging, no demands. Samuel draped his coat over the back of the other chair, a small gesture, yet patient. Then he sat, resting his hands on the table, listening as the night opened like a slow door. In a house no bigger than a song, there was silence wide enough for a late footstep to still find its place. At the edge of the wind, a wish as fragile as a strand of smoke held itself upright. If someone were to knock, he would not rush to ask where from, or where to. He would simply stir the fire higher, slide the second bowl toward the far side of the table. And in that way, the fear of closeness eased. On that fateful morning, what he found by the fence was not a stray calf, but a girl abandoned in the cold mist. Dawn retreated, leaving Wyoming still drowsy under its veil of silver fog. Samuel rode his old horse along the eastern fence line, where the wind often shoved the posts downhill. Nothing unusual, only the faint hum of wire and the steady strike of hooves on hard earth. He moved as he always did, in the rhythm of habit, finding a loose post, tightening it down, then letting the horse step on slowly. But this morning was different. At the corner of the fence, where the ground sagged and the grass grew thick, he saw a shape curled into the fog. At first, he thought it only a stray calf. Samuel tied his horse and walked closer. As he neared, the outline sharpened into a human figure, thin, small, slumped against a post, hair heavy with dew, her patched dress in tatters. Her wrists bore raw rope marks, swollen and red, the silent imprint of a night spent bound. Samuel froze, as if the earth beneath his boots had stopped breathing. For years he had trained himself to leave untouched whatever lay beyond his fence. Yet that morning, the breath of mist, the sound of his horse snorting behind him, all seemed to push him one step further. He bent down. The girl's face was pale as fog, her lips cracked, her eyes sunken, as though the night wind had dragged her to the edge of life. He drew his knife and cut through the rope, his hands trembling, not from cold, but from some old memory stirred loose inside him. When the bonds slipped from her wrists, the girl let out a faint groan and opened her eyes. Her gaze darted, wild with fear, like a cornered animal. She sprang upright, pressing back against the fence, breath breaking in ragged bursts, ready to bolt at the slightest move. Samuel did not reach out, nor did he say much. He simply stood still, leaving the distance wide enough. The wind carried with it the faint smoke from the fire he had left burning in the cabin, brushing against the taut silence between them. In the girl's eyes, suspicion glimmered, sharp and bristling, like strands of steel. He knew that fear. It was no stranger. He had carried it himself through long stretches of his own life. Without a word of explanation, Samuel bent down, picked up the severed rope, and slipped it into his pocket. A small gesture, but it carried the weight of a promise. The bonds no longer held any power. Then he turned back, walking slowly toward his horse, giving her time to decide for herself. Behind him, the girl still crouched, her eyes fixed on his every movement. The morning wind threaded through the grass, cold and unyielding, like a hand that refused to let go. Yet somewhere on the horizon, a thin blade of light cut across the sky, touching her frightened eyes. And Samuel understood. The ordinary morning was over. From now on, the fence would no longer be just wood and barbed wire. It had become the fragile boundary between a past steeped in shadows and a day not yet dared to believe in. Inside the small cabin, they sat facing each other, one wary, the other awkward, the barrier of silence thicker than barbed wire. Samuel brought the girl back to the cabin just as the sun lifted over the ridge. The horse moved at a slow pace, hooves striking the ground with the hollow rhythm of a morning sigh. She sat behind the saddle without touching his back, holding her distance with the tense grip of both hands clutched on the leather strap. The cabin door opened, light spilling over rough wooden walls, the faint smell of cooled ash still lingering. Samuel rekindled the stove, feeding logs into the fire, each motion heavy but practiced. He poured water into a tin mug, set it on the table, and stepped back. The girl stayed pressed to the door, eyes darting around like a wild creature caught inside a pen, before finally edging forward to take the cup. Water touched her parched lips, and her hands trembled so badly the rim sloshed against her mouth. Samuel said nothing. He turned instead, stepping outside to give her space. A man long acquainted with silence, he knew that any word now would only build the fence higher between them. He split firewood, the thud of the axe striking through the quiet like a slow heartbeat, holding the day together. Inside, the girl sat at the table, her back rigid, her eyes always angled toward the door. From time to time, her gaze wandered toward the boots set neatly by the hearth or the heavy coat hanging on its peg. Ordinary things, signs of a steady life. But to her, they were no more than the trappings of a stopover, not yet a place of safety. By noon, Samuel brought out a pot of simple soup. He set down 2 bowls. One he slid gently toward her, the other he filled for himself. They ate in silence, broken only by the clink of spoons against the rim. Each mouthful seemed to draw the distance a little closer, yet no words were spoken. From time to time, she lifted her gaze and met his, gray, steady, neither hurried nor probing, before lowering it again. After the meal, she rose, meaning to wash the bowl she had used. But Samuel stepped forward, took it lightly from her hands, and set it in the basin without a word. He gave only a small nod, then turned back to his task. Awkward as it was, the gesture felt like reassurance that needed no language. That afternoon, Samuel worked in the yard, mending the reins. The girl sat on the porch steps, her arms wrapped around her knees, watching each slow movement of his hands. The wind slid through the dry grass, carrying with it a faint char of smoke from the stove. The distance between them remained, a barrier not of wood or wire, but of unspoken histories both of them bore. Yet somewhere within that space, a tender root had begun to take hold. The presence of the other was no longer suffocating. In the small cabin under the vast sky, 2 wounded souls sat side by side without needing to fill the silence. The barrier still stood, but the quiet between them had begun to breathe with a new rhythm, the careful rhythm of 2 spirits learning how to stay. Each small act, a bowl of hot soup, a scrap of cloth over the doorway, slowly stripped the cabin of its sense of solitude. Day after day, the prairie stretched out in pale sunlight. Samuel worked as he always had, stoking the fire, patching the saddle, stacking hay, walking the fence line. But the presence of the girl, Anna, a name he caught once in a hoarse voice that sounded afraid of itself, had changed the color of silence inside the cabin. In the mornings, he set an extra cup by the coffee pot. No one asked, no one said thank you. Yet whenever steam curled from the rim of the mug, he saw Anna's eyes blink a little slower, her hands unclench a little more. Fear did not vanish in a day, but it began to loosen thread by thread, like rope fraying under steady rain. In the afternoons, when Samuel split wood outside, Anna sometimes came to the doorway, standing still to watch. He did not ask why. He simply let the steady rhythm of the axe against wood fill the air, like the heartbeat of someone no longer panicked. On some days, she picked up a small log, laid it gently on the pile of unburned wood. The motion was clumsy, but Samuel made no correction. He only let it be, as if nodding his quiet acceptance. Inside the cabin, the fire flickered against the long nights. Samuel had been used to one chair, but now there was a smaller figure settled near the hearth. Anna spoke little, only reaching for kindling, now and then blowing gently into the flames. Sometimes she tilted her head, listening to the wind slip through the cracks in the door, her eyes distant, as though afraid an old dream might surge back. Samuel did not intrude. He knew there were silences more precious than any answer. On some nights, Anna went to the well to draw water, her shadow stretching long across the dry earth. Samuel stood on the porch, watching. He didn't step closer, didn't take the bucket from her hands. He only stood there, letting her feel the presence of a gaze that neither pressed nor claimed, just enough to prove that in this wide, vast land, she was no longer wholly alone. Another day, Samuel returned from tending the horses to find the cabin door ajar, the dishes washed and set neatly on the table. The girl sat on the porch, knees drawn to her chest. This time, when he looked her way, she did not avert her eyes. There was no smile, only a small nod. But in that nod, Samuel recognized the first fragile rhythm of trust, stirring in a house that had known only the sound of wind. The prairie was still boundless, the wind still carrying red dust, the night still cold as ever. But now, beneath the roof of the little wooden cabin, there was a second breath, not loud, not restless, only slow and steady, enough to soothe a heart long afraid of closeness, and to awaken in Samuel something he thought had been lost forever, the feeling of someone staying. When he saw the girl flinch, he realized he was watching his own childhood rise again. One evening, the weather turned. Gray clouds gathered over the hills, and wind shoved through the cracks, making the fire in the stove flare and snap. Anna sat huddled nearby, hands cupping a tin mug, her eyes fixed on the flames, as if trying to read an ancient language. Samuel sat across from her, feeding wood into the stove, slow, careful, never staring straight at her. Yet, in the faint tremor of her shoulders, he caught the outline of himself from long ago. Back then, he had trembled the same way, in another wooden house, where his father's hand was more familiar with the lash and with anger than with gentleness. He remembered the feeling of pressing himself tight against the wall, hoping the shadows could hide the bruises. Each time Anna startled at the howl of the wind, it sharpened his memory of heavy footsteps in the night, the sound that once made a boy hold his breath for hours. Anna said nothing, but he read her story in the way she folded inward, like a small bird that could not trust the branch to bear its weight. Whenever she accidentally dropped her spoon on the floor, fear flashed in her eyes, waiting for a shout, a blow. But nothing came. Only Samuel quietly stooping to pick it up, rinsing it clean, and setting it back before her. He didn't speak. He knew any explanation now would only build the distance higher. One late night, Samuel stepped outside to fetch more firewood. When he came back in, he caught Anna standing before the old, clouded mirror, her fingers brushing lightly over the faint scar on her wrist. She startled, quickly hiding her hand in the fold of her dress. Samuel lowered his head and walked past, giving her back the space she needed, as though he had seen nothing. But inside his chest, an old wound tore open. That night, he sat alone for a long while on the porch. The wind dragged red dust across the prairie. The howl of wolves carried faint and far. His heart clenched, not only out of pity, but from the sharp recognition that his own shadowed past was repeating itself in her. No blood bound them, yet he felt the threat of a pain he had once believed belonged to him alone. When he returned inside, Anna had dozed off by the fire, her hand still clasping the empty mug. Samuel gently pulled a blanket over her shoulders. A small gesture, but in that moment he understood. He was no longer just a bystander. The figure of his past had found its reflection and its responsibility in a pair of young, frightened eyes. In the wooden cabin, the wind still howled outside, but the fire had settled into a steady glow, burning low like a heart that had learned endurance. Samuel sat in his old chair, his eyes resting on the girl asleep by the hearth, and thought to himself, some wounds can never be erased, but they can be held gently enough to make the pain less sharp. Dust rising on the horizon, the past still circling, searching for a way back. That afternoon, the sky was so clear he could see the far-off mountains like ink stains bleeding across the edge of the world. Samuel was in the yard, repairing a set of reins, while Anna sat on the porch steps, fingers laced together, her gaze drifting aimlessly over the fields. The wind carried the scent of dry earth and the faint tang of old, burned grass. Nothing warned of trouble, until Samuel lifted his head and noticed the difference, a faint streak of dust forming on the horizon. He set the awl down slowly, his eyes narrowing. That was no wind-blown haze. It was horse dust, a band of riders closing in. Long years had taught him to read such signs. At least 3 men, moving fast, spurring their horses hard. Nothing like ranch hands chasing stray cattle. Anna saw it too. She jerked upright, clutching the folds of her dress tight in her fists. In her eyes, still shadowed by what she carried, the fear burst out like a spark on dry kindling. Samuel didn't ask. He didn't need the answer. The way her body trembled told him enough. This was the past she had not yet outrun. He stepped toward the fence, standing tall, one hand resting lightly on the revolver that had long hung untouched. Yet the gun stayed in its place. The wind tugged at his coat, setting the fabric to flap. He didn't move, only fixed his eyes on the rising dust in the distance. The silence between him and the riders swelled, taut as a drawn wire. The gap closed slowly, until at last the streak of dust veered suddenly, turning onto the trail that led down toward town. The horseman never came near, leaving behind only a faint cloud suspended in the air. Samuel remained where he was, watching the horizon until he was certain it held nothing but grass and wind. When he turned back, Anna was still on the porch, her hands clutched tight, her face pale. Samuel walked toward her slowly, said nothing, and laid his coat across her shoulders. She shivered, then sank down, her breathing gradually evening out. There was no need for questions, no need to drag the past into words. Sometimes courage wasn't found in the firing of a gun, but in standing firm, neither leaving nor letting the world pass someone by. As the day waned, the sunlight stretched long across the fence line. Samuel quietly returned to his work, while Anna sat still, the heavy coat on her shoulders like an unspoken promise. In the silence, they both understood. Fear had not vanished, but it was no longer carried by one alone. He could let her go, but he knew that if he did, he would also be abandoning the child who once bore his own name. That night, the wind came hard and cold, sweeping down from the black mountains in the distance. The cabin stood like a wooden box set adrift in a sea of grass. In the stove, the fire had dwindled, leaving only a bed of glowing coals. Samuel sat at the table, hands still, eyes fixed on the embers, as though they might hold the answer to the weight on his mind. Anna lay on the folding bed in the corner, eyes closed, but her breath uneven. He knew she wasn't asleep. These past days she had always been that way, her body inside the cabin, but her mind hovering outside the fence line, ready to bolt at any moment. Samuel understood. 20 years earlier, he had done the same, lying awake each night thinking of his legs, desperate to carry him as far away as possible. The wind forced itself through the cracks, carrying with it the smell of dry grass and dust. Samuel rose quietly, added wood to the stove. The flames leapt briefly, then settled. Turning back, he saw Anna curl tighter beneath the thin blanket, her hands clutching it to her chest. A thought flashed in him. He could let her go. In the morning, give her some food, a change of clothes. She could leave, and he would return to the silence he knew. And she would be alone again. That thought stood very near, only a step away. But within him, another step formed, heavier, but truly his own, to stay. Not out of duty, not out of pity, but because when he looked into her frightened eyes, he saw himself as he once was. To let her go would be to abandon the boy he had once been, left without anyone to stand beside him. He returned to the table, poured water into his cup. The sound trickled faintly through the still house. No vows, no promises needed. The decision was already there. From this day on, he would not let her be alone, whether she chose to admit it or not. The next morning, with the sun just lifting, Samuel went out to the barn. He found Anna already awake, awkwardly holding a bucket as she fumbled with the chestnut horse. The animal snorted, making her step back half a pace. Samuel said nothing. He only moved closer, took hold of the reins, and let her try again. She glanced at him, a flicker of unease in her eyes, but this time she didn't turn away. It was a small gesture, but it marked a boundary crossed. In silence, a decision had been shared. Samuel never said he had chosen to stay, but Anna felt it. And when she set the bucket down and turned back toward the cabin, her narrow shoulders were drawn a little less tightly than before. Out on the prairie, the wind never ceased, but inside the cabin, the silence had changed. It was no longer the shell of loneliness. It was beginning to grow into a space wide enough for two. One afternoon, she washed the dishes, covered the window, gathered the hay. Trust began to grow out of nameless tasks. The afternoon stretched across the prairie like a honey-colored scarf. Samuel sat on the porch, sharpening an old knife, each slow, steady stroke marking the rhythm of his own private clock. Inside, Anna moved a chair, gathered the bowls left from lunch. At first, Samuel thought she was only tidying, but then he heard the faint trickle of water in the wooden basin. She was washing. He looked up, through the crack of the doorway. Her small frame bent over, thin hands carefully scrubbing each spoon. The motion was clumsy, water soaking into her sleeves, yet she did not stop. Samuel didn't step in. He only let the knife rest in his hand, afraid that even a careless movement might shatter the moment. When he finally came inside, the dishes were stacked neatly on the table, every piece aligned. Anna now sat on the porch steps, her eyes turned toward the grass beyond. No words passed, but in her gaze there was less guardedness, something lighter taking its place, as if for the first time she allowed herself to sit without bracing to run. Another day, Samuel noticed the window had been covered with a strip of old cloth. No one asked, no one told her to. That evening, when he lit the fire, Anna quietly set another small piece of wood to keep the flames steady. Such gestures were small, without fanfare, without words, yet they carried more weight than any conversation could. One afternoon, the wind scattered the hay drying in the yard. Samuel was still busy with the saddle when he saw Anna bend to gather it, carrying small bundles into the shelter. Her hands, still untrained for ranch work, shook as the dry stalks scraped her skin, but she did not let go. Samuel came over, took part of the load, and together they stood in the sun, stacking the hay in silence. When it was done, she exhaled softly and looked at him, just a small nod, but within it, trust was quietly growing. That evening, they sat by the fire. Samuel ladled the soup, and for the first time, he did not set a bowl upside down. He pushed it straight toward her. Anna accepted it, a little slow, but without flinching. The firelight cast across her face, revealing eyes that once turned away, but now dared to meet his. Outside, night fell across the prairie, the howl of wolves echoing faint in the distance. Inside the cabin, silence was no longer a wall between them, but a shared language. Trust had not come through promises, but through a hot bowl of soup, a cloth drawn over a window, and two sets of hands gathering hay beneath the sun. It was the afternoon of trust, slow, cautious, yet strong enough to light the shadows that had lingered in them too long. As twilight fell, the two chairs were no longer empty. Companionship, however fragile, was enough to warm the prairie. The evening sun dropped over the plains like a weary ball of fire, stretching the shadows of horses and fence posts across the dusty ground. Samuel sat on the porch steps, his back against the weathered boards, the brim of his hat shading half his face. Beside him, Anna sat quietly, hands folded in her lap, her gaze following the last streak of light as it drained from the grasslands. No words passed between them. The only sound was the wind threading through the dry grass. Yet in that silence, Samuel felt something different. Not the hollow emptiness of long years alone, but a quiet fullness, as though another breath had chosen to remain within these small walls. A lark darted by, its wings beating a brief, sharp rhythm. Anna tilted her head slightly, her eyes no longer tight with tension as they had been in the beginning. Only a thin hesitation remained, like a scarf lifting in the breeze. Samuel glanced at her. He didn't smile, but a gentle crease settled at the corner of his eyes. Slowly he rose, fetched the pair of boots standing neatly by the door, and set them down near the chair opposite his own. A simple gesture, offered without explanation. Anna looked down, her lashes lowering, as though hiding something stirring deep within her chest. Outside, the prairie surrendered its glow, the red wash of sunset fading into violet blue. When darkness settled, Samuel lit the fire again. The flames flickered, casting their glow on the second bowl at the table. No longer turned upside down, but set upright, ready. Anna sat across from him, her hand brushing the table's edge, as if to make sure she was truly there. There were no promises, no plans for tomorrow. Yet in that evening both of them knew the road ahead had shifted from the moment she appeared by the fence. The prairie was still vast, the wind still harsh, but companionship, fragile, slow-growing, was enough to bring warmth. At the far edge of the west, sometimes a wooden cabin, a fire in the hearth, and the quiet presence of another soul were already everything. On the wide prairie, where the wind carried both red dust and the scent of wild grass, lives that seemed forever lost could meet by chance at an old fence line. Samuel and Anna needed no vows, no loud declarations. They simply sat together, letting the small fire brighten a corner of the darkness inside them, and learning to believe that sometimes what we need most is not a perfect haven, but someone patient enough to stay. The story closes in warm silence, like the sound of hoofbeats fading into the sunset, leaving behind an echo for the listener to continue with their own memories. If you have ever walked through days of loneliness, ever carried in your heart a wound too deep to name, I invite you to leave a few words in the comments below. They don't need to be long or even complete, just a small voice to remind us that on this vast land, none of us travels alone.